Здравствуйте, меня зовут Maureen Minielli. The title of my presentation is The Importance of Archival Research in Communication Study, the 1972 Moscow Summit and the New York Times. This presentation has two particular goals in mind. First, to stress the importance of using archival research when we are examining communication events, and second, to take a look at how accurate the media is when they are reporting events of significant international stature and prestige. So the areas to be discussed in this presentation, we'll take a brief look at the 1972 Moscow Summit, but we're going to look at it through the lens of documents examined in the Nixon archives in Yorba Linda, California, and also the New York Times coverage of the summit between the periods of May 1 and May 31st, 1972. And the paper that accompanies this presentation resulted in 5 distinct conclusions that this presentation will discuss. But before we discuss the actual conclusions, let me give you a little brief background about the summit itself. It occurred during the week of May 22nd to May 28th, 1972, and it was preceded 3 months earlier by Nixon's unprecedented trip to China, which occurred in February 1972. And one of the reasons Nixon wanted to visit China was to prompt the Soviets into hosting a meeting which resulted in the summit. Nixon figured that if the Soviets saw that the American government was starting to engage in diplomatic relations with the Soviets' opponent, that being the Chinese, that this would prompt them to want to have a meeting with the American president and start discussing issues like nuclear weapons, nuclear armaments, and actually get the Soviets to negotiate and settle some issues between them. And that's exactly what happened, and that's how we got to the 1972 Moscow Summit in May. So the first conclusion we can draw through an analysis of the documents from the Nixon archives in Yorba Linda, California, and the New York Times coverage of the Moscow Summit between May 1st and May 31st, 1972, we can see that Nixon and his administration was very much interested in controlling the amount of information that would come out about the 1972 Moscow Summit, the decisions that were being made ahead of the actual summit. He was afraid that if there was too much pre-summit news coverage about the different topics that were being negotiated and results being finalized, that when it came to the actual time for the summit, the media would have nothing newsworthy to report. He was also concerned that the 1972 Moscow Summit would be seen as some sort of trick or some sort of way to enhance Nixon's prestige during the 1972 presidential election, in which he was trying to run for re-election. He was afraid that this would be seen as an opportunity for him to garner votes instead of actually trying to negotiate international diplomatic treaties with the Soviet Union on various topics. And we can see from this document from the Nixon archives dated March 11th, 1972, this is a memorandum from the president to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And it's here that he discusses why he wants to control the information. He said, "I believe that the expectations for the Moscow trip are being built up too much. What I am concerned about is not that we will fail to achieve the various goals about which there has been speculation, but that when we do make the formal agreements, there will be no real news value to them because of their having been discounted by an enormous amount of discussion prior to the summit." And the rest of the document, Nixon discusses strategies to limit the amount of information being given out or being that the media would receive through their contacts in the administration. Primarily what he wants to do is he wants to limit the amount of information that the media has by putting a moratorium on the Nixon administration and restricting their discussions with the news media. This document illustrates how extensive the planning was of the discussion of the various topics that were going to be negotiated at the summit, starting at the top left. You can't see it very well, but it starts in March, and then along the top you'll see that the month of April and the month of May are identified, and then the various topics, what would be discussed when, occurs pretty much towards the end of March and the beginning of April, and we see that very few discussions are actually to be held ahead of time during May. That actually was reserved for last-minute details and getting everyone ready for the actual trip. The second conclusion we can draw from this comparison of Nixon documents in the New York Times is that Nixon's fears of mundane news coverage did come true, but not for the reasons that he had anticipated. He was afraid that too much talk ahead of time would make the actual agreements, the announcements of the agreements, not very important. But instead, what happened was, in early May of 1972, the Nixon administration had decided to mine Haiphong Harbor and bomb the supply lines in North Vietnam. And it was this news that actually made the actual agreements discussed at the at the summit to be mundane, because they were the media was more focused on whether or not the summit would be canceled as a result of American military activities, instead of having the summit continue on. So when we look at the actual New York Times coverage during May of 1972, we see that the summit cancellation is predominating the news attention, and it's appearing on the front page of the New York Times. But when it comes to the actual summit, the actual agreements that have been announced, they actually occurred in the middle pages of the newspaper. And this article is an example of how the news about the agreements were buried in the New York Times. This is an article from May 24th that shows up on page 46 of the New York Times. And this article discusses the first two agreements that were to arise out of the Moscow summit that focused on pollution and joint medical research. And in the box that I've highlighted, the New York Times says, both documents were, of course, negotiated earlier, yet their final approval at the summit is a useful symbolic affirmation of the common humanity and common problems binding the Soviets and the American people. So we can see that Nixon's worries about the actual results of the summit being announced during the summit would not be newsworthy and occur on the first page. As this article testifies, it shows up towards the end of the first section of the New York Times. The third conclusion we can draw from an analysis of the various documents is the emergence of Soviet equality, in the sense that the Soviets were promoting the summit as a way of demonstrating to the citizens back home that they were finally on equal level with the United States. The Nixon administration was aware of these Soviet equality claims and allowed Brezhnev to do this because he was aware that Brezhnev needed domestic political capital at home and needed to demonstrate to the citizens of the Soviet Union that these were significant discussions that needed to be conducted, and that they were finally on equal level with the American people and with the American government. And the New York Times was also aware of this tactic by Brezhnev and the Soviet Union to demonstrate that they were on equal terms with the Americans. This article, or this document from the Nixon administration on the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, definitely indicates to the Nixon administration that they were aware of Brezhnev's manipulation of the summit for domestic capital at home. In the box it says, SALT also has a definitive political character for the Soviets. It marks, in their view, a definitive achievement of equal status with the United States. And the New York Times also picked up on this in their article on May 20th, where it says in the box, the prospect of dealing with Mr. Nixon on an equal footing, and thereby confirming Soviet global power and prestige, will be as important a gain as any of the specific agreements expected to emerge from the meetings. Now, this is not to say that the Nixon administration also did not milk the 72 summit for domestic political gain at home. They did. But here is where we start seeing the public announcement by the Soviets that they were on equal footing with the Americans to the Soviet people. Conclusion 4 is entitled No Vietnam, and this is somewhat surprising when you look at the New York Times coverage of the 1972 Moscow summit. The New York Times had anticipated Vietnam to be a significant summit topic to be discussed between the Americans and the Soviets. And while Vietnam was discussed during the summit, it wasn't discussed as extensively as the New York Times had anticipated, and this was due primarily to two reasons. First, the Nixon administration was somewhat successful in plugging leaks about their negotiations of Vietnam with the Soviets, so that the media was not really sure what was going to be discussed. But also, this was due to, second, to a strategy known as triangulation that the New York Times had not been aware of. The Nixon administration had employed this strategy of triangulation since 1969, and basically what it did was it pitted the Russians and the Chinese against each other. And the Nixon administration would dangle carrots, for example, like most favored nation status, or we would send grain to the Soviet Union in exchange for one of the countries being able to convince Hanoi to return to the negotiating table and try to negotiate some sort of peace settlement in Vietnam. It had been anticipated by the New York Times that the Soviet Union was the stronger of the two countries who would have the most influence on Hanoi. But as we will learn in the next document, we will see that by the time that the summit came around, the Nixon administration had discovered that the Soviet Union was not going to be as helpful to the U.S. in getting Hanoi back to the negotiating table, but instead it was the Chinese who had the most influence on Hanoi. So this article from the New York Times on May 21st talks about what they thought was how important Vietnam was in the negotiating summit, in the summit negotiations. The beginning of the article says the subject of Vietnam will, of course, be very much on both Mr. Nixon and Mr. Brezhnev's minds. And then later on in the article, in the yellow box, it says, Mr. Nixon will probably repeat his belief that the Russians can do more than they have done in putting pressure on Hanoi to show restraint and to begin a genuine give and take in negotiations with the United States. And this is where the New York Times erred in their media accuracy, because they are telling their readers that they expect the Vietnam War to be a significant topic to be discussed, but in effect it was not. But that's because they were not aware of the strategy that the Nixon administration had been employing for several years. This document from the Nixon archives is entitled Vietnam, and it discusses the Soviets' perception of Vietnam and their role with Hanoi. And it is in this document at the bottom that we see that the Nixon administration, pretty much a month prior to the summit, had discovered that it was not the Soviet Union who had influence on Hanoi, more so than the Chinese, but it was in fact the Chinese who had more influence. The document says, the outcome suggests that the Soviets have little influence in Hanoi when it comes to basic issues of a settlement or military strategy. Indeed, their role as a third party may be resented by Hanoi. And it's here that we see where the New York Times erred, because they did not have information or were unaware of this strategy that the Nixon administration had been trying to employ for the previous 3.5 years. And so that's the reason why Vietnam was not heavily discussed during the summit, because the Soviets were of no use to the Americans. So they wanted to focus on different topics like space exploration. The fifth conclusion ties back to the second conclusion, which was about mundane news coverage. And the news coverage was mundane, but it was mundane because a lot of information had been released about the summit negotiations, the final agreements, well in advance of the summit. So the New York Times needed to find some sort of hook or some sort of way of keeping their readers involved in keeping their attention on the New York summit. So instead of focusing on the actual agreements being negotiated, they instead focused on the early May military actions of the U.S. In terms of bombing the supply lines in North Vietnam and the mining of Haiphong Harbor. The New York Times speculated pre-summit that they thought the summit might be canceled because of the U.S. military actions. And they continued this theme of summit cancellation even as the summit occurred, and even at the end of the summit as well. And this, in part, could be chalked up to a mutual dislike between Nixon and his administration and the New York Times. Nixon thought the New York Times was too liberal in their reporting and was not supportive of his ideas and his administration's policies. In fact, he thought that the New York Times denigrated Nixon and his administration, and in fact, they did. They pretty much did not like each other. So this article from May 8th addresses the topic of the summit possibly being canceled because of U.S. military actions. In the box it says, but some diplomats feel the mining of North Vietnam's ports has raised the possibility of cancellation of Mr. Nixon's scheduled trip to Moscow 2 weeks from today, and even of a military confrontation if Soviet naval forces try to thwart Mr. Nixon's actions. In this article on May 11th, the New York Times reported a discussion between a newsman and the Soviet foreign trade minister about the possibility of the summit being canceled. And in the box it says, on his way back to the Soviet embassy, Mr. Pachilev was asked by a newsman whether Mr. Nixon's visit to Russia was still on. We never had any doubts about it, he said through an interpreter. I don't know why you asked this question. Have you any doubts? And so if we were to look at the continuing coverage of the New York Times summit, you would see this theme of the summit being canceled continuing past May 11th, going on through the actual summit. And then in the reporting as the summit was concluding and Nixon was traveling back to the United States, basically the New York Times continued this theme of cancellation, even though the summit occurred and even though they were told back on May 11th that the summit would occur. And so basically what the New York Times was doing was they were trying to make news where news wasn't there, and then also they were trying to denigrate Nixon once again, suggesting that his military actions could have thwarted a summit and could have led to disaster results unless something had occurred. And what actually occurred was the Soviets had always planned on continuing to have the summit. They thought a little bit about canceling, but they decided that the military actions of the U.S. was not enough to actually warrant cancellation of the summit. So this presentation took a look at the 1972 Moscow summit and compared internal Nixon White House documents to articles written in the New York Times during May 1972, and it drew 5 conclusions. There was information control exercised by the Nixon administration, which resulted in mundane news coverage in the New York Times. We see the rise of prominence of the notion of Soviet equality in comparison to the United States, coming both out of the Nixon administration's documents as well as the New York Times. We see that the New York Times erred in its media reporting because they thought Vietnam would be discussed more heavily at the summit than it was, and that was primarily an error on their part due to 2 reasons. Nixon and his administration being successful in not releasing information to the media about their negotiations in Vietnam, and then also the New York Times and the American people being unaware of a secret strategy that Nixon had been employing for several years, which was to try to get the Chinese and Russians to compete against each other in order to hopefully get one of the countries to talk Hanoi back to the negotiation table, and in return, America would give them several perks. And then we see the New York Times media coverage of the summit actually turning from reporting of the actual agreements that had been negotiated beforehand and announced during the summit, but instead catching on to this theme of the summit being possibly canceled because of the U.S. military action in early May. So the conclusions of this research, we can glean 3 definitive results. We can see that the New York Times was accurate most of the time, despite information control implemented by the Nixon administration. We can see that the New York Times error in their reporting was about the importance of the Vietnam to Nixon, but unbeknownst to them, they did not know that the Nixon administration had discovered prior to the summit that the Soviet Union could not help them with Vietnam. And so this was an error on the part of the New York Times. And then we see that the New York Times sensationalized the early May U.S. military activities primarily due to their dislike of Nixon and his administration, his ideas and his policies, and also aware that the Nixon administration did not like the New York Times. The limitations to this paper, first of all, there's incomplete research. There's a lot more documents that need to be studied and examined out of the Nixon archives, and that there's also a lot of mundane memos that talk about the give and take in the negotiations, where some of the discussions are just not really worth reporting on. Probably more important, though, the biggest limitation on the paper in this presentation is that there's a lot of documents that are not available out of the Nixon archives, primarily because they haven't been processed, they haven't been screened, and then released to the public either in the library itself or available online. And then also we see, because of the unavailable documents, a primary reason for this is because of censorship. Even though this event occurred 44 years ago, there's a lot of information that the U.S. government, they do not want it to be released to the American public and to the world, particularly strategies and activities that were occurring at the time in the interest of national security. So if you were to look at the Nixon documents, you would see a lot of information being blacked out or censored. It's because the federal government doesn't want this information to be released, even though this occurred almost half a century ago. Thank you very much. Спасибо большое.